"Some places deserve a better bride," Chloe Bennet said, and the room went quiet before the champagne stopped trembling in the glasses. Rosewood Estates stood above the Newport cliffs in the blue-gray light of early evening, its stone walls washed by a soft coastal rain, its windows glowing like old gold against the wet gardens. Inside the grand ballroom, white roses climbed the arches, crystal chandeliers burned over polished oak floors, and a string quartet played softly near the fireplace as if elegance could make cruelty sound less deliberate. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the garden doors with her hands folded around a small black clutch, feeling the cold outline of an old brass key hidden inside. She had not expected to be invited. The cream envelope had arrived that morning with Alexander's assistant's careful handwriting and a note saying the evening was only a private preview for donors, friends, and future wedding vendors. Civilized, Alexander had called it over the phone. Easier for everyone, he had said. Eleanor had learned that when a man like Alexander said easier, he usually meant quieter for him. Then she walked into Rosewood and saw Chloe on his arm. Chloe wore a pale blush gown that swept the floor in soft layers, her diamond earrings catching every chandelier, as if the room had been built to admire her. Alexander stood beside her in a black tuxedo, one hand resting lightly at her back, his face calm in the expensive way that had once fooled Eleanor into mistaking control for strength. Behind them, guests moved between silver trays and tall candles, their laughter thinning when they saw Eleanor by the doors. Some recognized her. Some recognized the estate. All of them understood enough to look away too late. Chloe lifted her glass again, smiling directly at Eleanor now. "Rosewood has history," she said, her voice bright and clear. "But history should not keep beautiful places trapped in sad memories." A few guests shifted. One woman near the piano lowered her eyes. Eleanor did not move. Through the glass behind her, the rose garden stretched into the rain, white blooms bending beneath the weather, the same path where she had once walked in a wedding dress while her mother cried quietly from the first row. The same stone steps, the same iron lanterns, the same estate Alexander had entered through marriage and now pretended had always belonged to his world. Chloe turned toward Margaret Lawson, the wedding planner standing near a table covered in linen samples and floral sketches. "We will use the garden aisle, of course," Chloe said, "and the bridal suite upstairs. I want everything changed from the old wedding. New flowers, new music, new name on the garden program." She paused, then added softly, "No trace of the previous bride." The sentence did not need volume to wound. It moved across the ballroom like a draft under a locked door. Alexander finally looked at Eleanor, but not with apology. With warning. "Eleanor," he said, low enough to seem private and loud enough to be understood, "please do not make this uncomfortable." She looked at the man she had once married under the rose arch outside, the man who had promised to protect her heart beneath this very roof, and saw only a guest wearing borrowed importance. Her fingers tightened around the clutch. Inside it, the brass key pressed against her palm, old and familiar, engraved with the Caldwell crest Chloe had not noticed on the gates. Eleanor lowered her eyes for one breath, not in defeat, but to steady herself. When she looked up again, Chloe was still smiling, Alexander was still silent, and Margaret Lawson had stopped arranging the linen cards. The planner was staring at Eleanor now, then at the estate contract folder beside the floral samples, as if the room had just said something it did not yet understand. Eleanor had been 11 the first time her mother let her hold the estate key. It was too heavy for a child's hand, brass darkened by age, the Caldwell crest worn smooth in the center from generations of fingers turning it through winter locks and summer doors. Margaret Caldwell had placed it in Eleanor's palm at the front gate of Rosewood Estate on a windy April morning, when the ocean below the cliffs sounded restless and the garden beds were still brown from the cold. "A home remembers who loved it," her mother had said, guiding Eleanor through the iron gates while rainwater clung to the white roses not yet blooming. Back then, Rosewood did not look like the polished estate guests admired tonight. The greenhouse roof leaked in 3 places. The ballroom smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The stone path to the garden had cracked near the fountain, and the bridal suite upstairs held more boxes than furniture. But Margaret walked through every room as if she were greeting someone alive. She knew which windows caught morning light, which floorboards creaked near the library, which rosebush had been planted by Eleanor's grandmother after the war. She did not treat the estate like property. She treated it like memory with walls. Eleanor grew up watching her mother save rosewood inch by inch. She saw gardeners return after years away, painters restore the blue ceiling in the east parlor, electricians hide new wires behind old plaster so the house could breathe without losing its face. On summer evenings, Margaret hosted small fundraisers in the garden, not for vanity, but for families who needed medical bills paid, young women who needed tuition, local workers who needed a month of rent after a bad season. Wealth, she told Eleanor, should move quietly towards someone else's pain. That was why, years later, when Eleanor married Alexander beneath the white rose arch, she believed she was not only marrying a man. She was opening the door of her family's heart to him. Alexander had looked handsome that day in a black tuxedo, his smile steady, his hand warm around hers as the wind lifted the veil from her shoulder. He had told her rosewood felt sacred. He had said her mother's garden made him understand what legacy meant. Eleanor believed him because love often begins by giving someone credit for the best sentence they ever say. After Margaret died, Alexander became fluent in the language of rosewood. He mentioned the estate at dinners, posed near the gates for charity magazines, invited investors to weekends on the lawn, and spoke of our family property with a confidence that made strangers assume his name was carved somewhere into the stone. Eleanor corrected him less and less. At first, because she was grieving. Later because marriage had taught her to choose peace in rooms where her truth might embarrass him. The estate documents stayed locked in her office. The Caldwell estate trust remained in her name. The taxes, restoration contracts, payroll, garden staff, insurance, and preservation approvals all moved quietly through her signature. Alexander enjoyed the glow without touching the work. Now, in the ballroom, Chloe was asking to erase the name of the woman who had kept Rosewood alive, and Alexander was letting her. Eleanor felt the old key inside her clutch and remembered her mother's hands, always smelling faintly of rose soap and paper. Across the room, the brass plaque outside the garden doors caught the chandelier light through the rain. Margaret Rosegarden. Her mother's name was still there, small and patient, waiting to see whether Eleanor would finally stop letting other people borrow what they had never loved. Chloe's request did not sound like a question. It sounded like a woman practicing ownership in a room that had not given it to her. She crossed the ballroom with her champagne glass held low, passing beneath the chandeliers as if the light belonged to her, then stopped in front of the long planning table where fabric swatches, menu cards, garden sketches, and old estate photographs had been arranged for review. One photograph showed Eleanor and Alexander beneath the white rose arch years earlier, her veil caught by the coastal wind, his hand resting over hers, Margaret Caldwell seated in the first row with tears bright on her face. Chloe looked at it for half a second, then smiled as if she had found something distasteful on fine china. "This should be removed," she said, tapping one manicured finger beside Eleanor's face. "Actually, all of these should be removed. I do not want the preview to feel haunted." The word haunted made someone near the fireplace inhale softly. Eleanor felt it more than heard it. She remained by the garden doors, the rain behind her drawing silver lines down the glass, the old brass key warming inside her clutch beneath the pressure of her hand. Alexander looked at the photograph, then at Chloe, then finally at Eleanor. There was a time when his eyes would have searched hers first, when even a small discomfort would have pulled him toward her. Now he only looked tired, as if her memory had become an inconvenience placed badly in the room. "Chloe wants a clean design," he said. "It is reasonable." Eleanor watched his mouth form the word reasonable and remembered how often unfair things became acceptable once they were spoken calmly by a man in a tuxedo. Chloe turned another page in the planner's binder. "And the garden," she continued. "The name is too old-fashioned. Margaret Rosegarden feels very memorial. I want something softer, more personal. Chloe's garden walk, maybe. We can have the new sign made before the wedding." Margaret Lawson, standing behind the table in a charcoal dress and pearl earrings, went still. Her fingers rested on the corner of the binder, but she did not turn the page. "That plaque is original to the estate," she said carefully. Chloe tilted her head. "Original does not always mean untouchable." A few guests looked toward the garden doors, where the brass plaque outside caught flashes of chandelier light through the wet glass. Margaret Rosegarden, Eleanor's mother's name, small and dignified, fixed near the roses she had saved from disease, storms, and neglect. Chloe followed their eyes and gave a quiet laugh. It is only a sign. Alexander stepped closer to Eleanor then, not enough to comfort her, only enough to manage her. His voice dropped, smooth and private in the way that made public cruelty look like a domestic problem. Please do not turn this into a scene. Eleanor lifted her eyes to him. The ballroom blurred for one breath. White roses, champagne, candlelight, Chloe's smile, Margaret Lawson's tight hand on the binder. She is asking to remove my mother's name, Eleanor said. Alexander's expression hardened with embarrassment rather than regret. You need to stop clinging to the past. The sentence landed harder than Chloe's laughter because it came from the man who had once stood in that garden and promised to honor everything that made Eleanor who she was. Her throat tightened, but she did not answer. She would not give him the relief of watching her break in a room he had filled with witnesses. Chloe smiled again, satisfied by the silence, and turned back to Margaret. Let us also reserve the bridal suite upstairs. I want it clear tonight. No old portraits, no old keepsakes, nothing that feels like her. Eleanor's fingers closed around the key until the edge pressed into her palm. Outside, rain touched the roses her mother had loved. Inside, Alexander stood beside another woman and let her erase the house piece by piece. Margaret Lawson lowered her eyes to the estate contract folder on the table, and for the first time that evening, she did not look like a planner taking instructions. She looked like a woman deciding which truth the room was finally ready to hear. After Alexander left, Eleanor did not move back to the city penthouse. She returned to Rosewood Estate in late February, when the cliffs were gray, the lawns were soaked from winter rain, and half the room smelled of cold stone and closed curtains. The house did not welcome her with comfort. It welcomed her with work. The greenhouse roof leaked over trays of sleeping herbs. The east parlor ceiling had a long water stain shaped like a river. The garden staff had been reduced to 2 men sharing 3 jobs, and the old kitchen range coughed smoke every time the cook tried to light it. Eleanor walked through every room with a legal pad in one hand and her mother's brass key in the other, making lists while grief followed her like a second shadow. She could have hired a management company and stayed away. She could have sold the estate to someone who would turn it into a private resort with better parking and no memory. Instead, she opened the windows. She met with roofers at 7 in the morning, wearing rain boots under a wool coat. She signed payroll checks at the kitchen table beside coffee gone cold. She approved repairs to the garden wall, replaced cracked panes in the conservatory, and kept every employee who had once called her mother Mrs. Caldwell with affection rather than obligation. There were mornings when she stood alone in the bridal suite and looked at the empty corner where her wedding portrait had once hung. Alexander had taken his copy from the penthouse, but the wall at Rosewood still seemed to remember the frame. Eleanor did not put it back. She did not need proof that the marriage had existed. The ache in her chest was proof enough. Slowly, the estate began to breathe again. The kitchen reopened for charity breakfasts. The ballroom hosted scholarship dinners, local hospital fundraisers, and winter coat drives for families along the coast. Eleanor turned the unused carriage house into temporary lodging for women rebuilding their lives after divorce, job loss, or quiet private disasters no one discussed at formal tables. She named the program the Margaret Caldwell Women's Housing Fund, but she never put her own face on the brochures. The donors praised Alexander sometimes, because his last name still sat beside hers in society columns, and he enjoyed standing near generosity when cameras were present. Eleanor let the mistake pass for a while, not because it did not hurt, but because the women sleeping safely in the carriage house mattered more than correcting gossip over canapes. Her recovery did not look like a grand transformation. It looked like invoices paid on time, fresh bread on the staff table, roses pruned before frost, and the first morning she woke in her childhood bedroom without reaching for a phone that no longer rang with apology. It looked like walking through the garden at dawn and realizing the silence was no longer empty. It belonged to her. By the time Chloe chose Rosewood for her preview, Eleanor had already spent months rebuilding the place Alexander thought he could display. She had restored the estate while he borrowed its glow. She had protected her mother's name while he learned to pronounce it only when it impressed guests. And now, standing in the ballroom as Chloe asked to clear the bridal suite and erase Margaret Caldwell from the garden plaque, Eleanor understood the difference between patience and surrender. Patience had kept Rosewood alive. Surrender would let strangers rename it. Across the room, Margaret Lawson opened the estate contract folder with careful hands, and Eleanor felt the brass key inside her clutch settle against her palm like a quiet answer finally ready to turn. Margaret Lawson had planned weddings for 31 years, and she had learned that the most dangerous requests were rarely shouted. They came wrapped in silk voices, delivered beside champagne, disguised as taste. Change the flowers. Move the widow's table farther back. Remove the photograph of the first wife. Do not mention the mother. Make the past less visible so the new bride can feel comfortable. Margaret had heard every version of cruelty spoken as design preference, but Chloe Bennett's request settled differently in her bones. It was not about color palettes or clean lines. It was about erasure. She stood behind the planning table with the estate contract folder open beneath her hands while the ballroom continued pretending to breathe. The string quartet had softened near the fireplace. Rain pressed against the tall garden windows. White roses bowed outside in the weather, and beyond the glass, the brass plaque reading Margaret Rose Garden flashed whenever the chandelier light caught it. Chloe waited with the slight impatience of a woman used to service bending quickly around her mood. Alexander stood beside her, polished and silent, his tuxedo smooth, his expression arranged to suggest the matter was beneath him. Eleanor remained near the garden doors, still as a portrait no one had permission to remove. Margaret remembered Eleanor's first wedding at Rosewood Estate. She remembered the younger bride standing in the bridal suite upstairs while Margaret Caldwell fastened one pearl button at the back of her gown with trembling fingers. She remembered Alexander that day, handsome and grateful, telling every guest that being welcomed into Rosewood felt like being trusted with a kingdom. Margaret had believed him then because weddings made even experienced women hopeful for strangers. Now he stood in the same house and allowed another woman to ask that his wife's mother be erased from the garden. Margaret lowered her eyes to the folder. The first pages were ordinary: rental schedule, catering notes, floral access, parking plan, vendor insurance, deposit receipt processed through an account. Alexander's assistant had provided. But the authority section was not ordinary. Rosewood Estate was not listed under Alexander Whitmore. It was not listed under any holding company tied to him. The property owner line read, Caldwell Estate Trust. Trustee Representative, Eleanor Caldwell Whitmore. Final approval required for structural, historical, memorial, suite, garden, and naming changes. Margaret let her thumb rest on that sentence. Final approval required. The words were quiet, but they carried more force than every glass raised in that room. She turned one more page and found Eleanor's signature, clean and steady in dark blue ink, authorizing only a preview event, not a wedding conversion, not the removal of memorial elements, not the use of the bridal suite, not the renaming of the garden. Chloe's voice floated back to her. Can we have the old portraits boxed up tonight? I do not want the upstairs suite to feel like a museum. Margaret looked up. The bridal suite is not included in tonight's approved access. Chloe blinked, as if a chair had spoken. Alexander said it would be fine. Margaret looked at Alexander then. He gave her the thin smile of a man expecting staff to understand hierarchy without being told. Margaret, I am sure we can be flexible. The planner closed the folder halfway, not loudly, just enough for the leather cover to make a soft final sound against the table. Flexibility still requires authorization. Eleanor's eyes lifted slightly from across the room. She did not smile. She did not nod. She only watched Margaret with the stillness of someone who had waited a long time for a fact to stand upright on its own. Chloe laughed once, light and brittle. This is a wedding preview, not a courthouse hearing. Margaret slipped one document free from the folder and placed it beside the floral sketches, smoothing the corner with 2 fingers. No, she said calmly. It is an estate event. That makes the owner's approval necessary. Around them, conversation thinned until the rain became the loudest sound in the ballroom. Alexander's expression sharpened. Chloe's glass paused halfway to her lips. Eleanor felt the brass key inside her clutch. And for the first time that night, it no longer felt like something she was hiding. It felt like something the house had been waiting for her to use. The ballroom tried to return to its music, but the room no longer trusted its own elegance. The quartet continued near the fireplace, soft strings moving beneath the chandeliers, yet every note sounded thinner now, as if even the instruments had heard Margaret Lawson say the owner's approval was necessary. Chloe recovered first because pride had trained her to treat resistance as poor service. She set her champagne glass on the planning table and gave Margaret a smile polished enough to cut. "Then let us keep this simple," she said. "We will show the concept video first. Everyone can see the vision, and then I am sure the formal details will follow." Formal details. Eleanor heard the phrase and looked toward the garden doors, where rain blurred the brass plaque into a small golden shape beyond the glass. Chloe was not asking permission. She was gathering applause before permission could become a problem. Alexander understood that too. His face remained calm, but one hand tightened slightly around the stem of his glass. He looked toward the guests, toward the donors, toward 2 board members from a foundation he had been trying to impress for months, and Eleanor saw the calculation pass through him. A public pause would make him look weak. A public correction would make him look dishonest. So he chose momentum, the old habit of men who believed moving forward fast enough could outrun the truth. "Go ahead," Alexander said to the audiovisual technician near the back wall. "Run the presentation." Margaret's eyes moved from Alexander to Eleanor. For one breath, the 2 women held the same silence across the room. Eleanor did not nod. She did not ask for help. She simply stood with the old key inside her clutch and let the next wrong thing reveal itself. The ballroom lights dimmed. A screen lowered above the mantel with a soft mechanical hum. Guests turned their chairs and lifted their phones, ready for romance, ready for spectacle, ready to forget the woman standing by the rain-streaked windows. The first image appeared, Rosewood Estate at sunrise, its iron gates opening slowly, white roses climbing along the garden path, the ocean shining below the cliffs. Then came the grand staircase, the east parlor, the bridal suite, the white rose arch, the very room where Eleanor's mother had buttoned her wedding gown. Across the screen, elegant gold letters appeared, "A new beginning at Rosewood." Chloe stepped closer to Alexander and smiled at the projection as if she had invented the house by wanting it. "The upstairs suite will be perfect for the dress reveal," she told the guests. "And the garden walk will be renamed before the ceremony, so everything feels fresh." A low murmur moved through the room. Eleanor felt the blue light from the screen wash over her face, turning the raindrops on the glass behind her into trembling silver. She watched strangers admire the staircase her mother had restored, the rose arch her mother had planted, the suite her mother had prepared with trembling hands on the morning Eleanor became a bride. Alexander did not look back. Chloe lifted her voice just enough to make the announcement feel intimate and public at once. "I want Rosewood to feel like it was waiting for us all along." Margaret Lawson closed the estate folder completely. The sound was soft, but Eleanor heard it through the music, through the rain, through the hum of the screen. Margaret took the original contract, slipped one page to the front, and walked toward the small microphone stand near the display. The audiovisual technician glanced at her, uncertain. Chloe's smile faltered. Alexander turned his head slowly. Margaret adjusted the microphone with careful hands, the contract held against her charcoal dress, and waited until the final image of the bridal suite glowed behind her. Then she looked out over the guests, past Chloe, past Alexander, and finally toward Eleanor by the garden doors. "Before any further presentation continues," she said calmly, "there is a required estate authorization that must be clarified." Margaret's voice did not rise, but it reached every corner of the ballroom because the room had already been waiting for permission to stop pretending. The concept. Video froze behind her on an image of the bridal suite, all pale curtains, antique mirrors, and the white velvet chair where Eleanor had once sat while her mother fastened the last pearl button on her gown. Blue light from the screen washed over Chloe's blush dress and turned Alexander's face colder than the rain beyond the windows. For a moment, no one moved. Even the quartet let the final note fade near the fireplace, leaving only the soft tapping of weather against the glass and the quiet mechanical hum of the projector. Chloe recovered with a smile that looked expensive and nervous. "Authorization?" she said, letting the word carry just enough amusement for the guests. Margaret, This is a wedding preview. We are not renovating a government building. A few people gave polite, uncertain laughs, then stopped when Margaret did not join them. Alexander stepped forward, placing himself between the planner and the room as if his body could still stand in for authority. "Margaret," he said, smooth and controlled, "we appreciate your attention to detail, but Chloe and I have approved the direction. You can continue." Eleanor watched him from beside the garden doors. There it was again, that confident "we." "Chloe and I approved. Continue." Words arranged like keys he did not own. Margaret looked down at the contract in her hands, then back at him. "The preview may continue only within the approved access terms." Chloe's eyes sharpened. "And who exactly approved those terms?" She asked it as a challenge, already turning slightly toward Alexander, inviting him to perform possession in front of the room. Alexander accepted the invitation because pride often walks willingly toward the edge. "I handled the venue," he said. "My office processed the deposit." Chloe lifted her glass again, encouraged by the familiar shape of his certainty. "Exactly. Alexander gave me rosewood for our wedding because he knows how much this place deserves a new beginning." Then she turned toward the guests, her voice softening into the practiced intimacy of a bride claiming a room. "I know some memories here are complicated, but love should not be held hostage by the past." Her eyes found Eleanor on the last word. The insult was wrapped in silk, but everyone heard the blade underneath. Eleanor felt the room look toward her, then away, then back again. Her throat tightened, not because Chloe had wounded her most deeply, but because Alexander stood beside her and let the sentence live. Margaret's hand tightened around the contract folder. "Ms. Bennett," she said, "the estate does not permit memorial names, family suites, or historical areas to be altered by event guests." Chloe lowered her glass. "Event guests." The word struck her harder than any accusation could have. "I am the bride." Margaret remained calm. "Tonight, you are a guest under a limited preview agreement." A murmur moved through the ballroom, soft as fabric dragged across stone. Alexander's expression changed then, a small crack beneath the polish. "This is unnecessary," he said. "You are embarrassing everyone." Margaret looked at him with the patience of a woman who had spent 3 decades watching men mistake correction for disrespect. "No, Mr. Whitmore. I am preventing an unauthorized use of the estate." Chloe laughed once, too brightly. "Then call the owner. I am sure he will be reasonable." The word owner hung in the air. Eleanor felt the old brass key inside her clutch, its edge pressed against her palm, steady and cold. Outside, the plaque for Margaret Rose Garden flashed again through the ring. Inside, Margaret Lawson turned one page of the contract and looked across the ballroom, not at Alexander, not at Chloe, but toward the woman standing quietly by the garden doors. Margaret Lawson did not call the owner. She simply looked at her. The silence that followed was so complete that the rain against the windows sounded like fingers tapping on glass. Eleanor remained by the garden doors, one hand closed around her black clutch, the other resting lightly against the wet reflection of the brass plaque beyond the panes. For years, she had let rosewood speak softly through repaired roofs, paid wages, restored gardens, and quiet charity dinners. She had never needed a room to know what belonged to her. But now the room needed to know. Margaret lifted the contract toward the microphone, not high enough to perform, only enough to make the paper visible beneath the chandelier light. "For clarity," she said, "Rosewood Estate is owned by the Caldwell Estate Trust. All historical spaces, family suites, memorial gardens, and naming rights require approval from the trustee representative." Chloe's smile returned for one last fragile second. "Then get the trustee representative," she said. Her voice was lighter than her face. Alexander did not speak. He had gone still beside her, as if some part of him already understood the step before the fall. Margaret turned fully toward the garden doors. "Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell Whitmore," she said, each name clean and deliberate, "as the owner and trustee representative of Rosewood Estate. Do you approve the removal of Margaret Caldwell's name from the garden, the use of the bridal suite, and the proposed changes to the historical areas?" The ballroom did not gasp. It simply stopped breathing. The image of the bridal suite remained frozen on the screen behind Margaret, pale curtains glowing blue-white above the mantel, while every guest turned from the screen to Eleanor. Chloe looked first at Margaret, then at Alexander, then finally at the woman she had been treating like a memory left behind. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Alexander's face lost its careful color. The black tuxedo, the champagne glass, the confident posture, all of it seemed suddenly borrowed from a life he had never owned. Eleanor opened her clutch and took out the old brass key. The Caldwell crest caught the chandelier light, worn smooth from her mother's hand, her grandmother's hand, and now hers. She walked across the ballroom without hurry. The guests made room for her instinctively, chairs shifting, silk dresses whispering, shoes quieting against polished oak. She did not look at Chloe as she passed. She did not look at Alexander until she reached the planning table. Then she placed the key beside the contract, directly next to the floral sketch where Chloe's garden walk had been written in gold ink. The two objects sat together under the lights, one old key, one new attempt at erasure. Eleanor looked at the paper for a moment, then at Margaret Lawson. "No," she said. The word was not loud, but it carried farther than Chloe's laughter had. Margaret nodded once, professional and solemn. "For the record, the owner does not approve the removal of the Margaret Rose Garden plaque, the renaming of the garden, the use of the bridal suite, or any alteration to protected historical spaces." A murmur moved through the room, not cruel, not delighted, but awake. Chloe's hand tightened around her glass until the champagne trembled. "Alexander," she whispered, but his name no longer sounded like protection. It sounded like a question. He stared at Eleanor. "You never told me you still controlled all of this." Eleanor looked at him calmly. "You never asked who kept it standing." That was when the final illusion broke. The estate he had used to impress donors, the ballroom he had offered to another woman, the garden he had allowed Chloe to rename, all of it stood beneath Eleanor's authority. Margaret closed the contract folder and turned off the frozen concept video. The bridal suite vanished from the screen, leaving only the reflection of chandeliers in the dark glass. Outside, the rain continued over the roses, and the plaque bearing Margaret Caldwell's name remained exactly where it had always been. The ballroom did not know what to do after the truth arrived, because truth had entered without music, without anger, without asking anyone for applause. It simply stood there on the planning table beside the old brass key and the closed estate contract, making every candle, every rose, and every champagne glass look suddenly accountable. Chloe remained near Alexander, her blush gown glowing beneath the chandeliers, but the confidence that had carried her across the room was gone. She looked toward the darkened screen where her wedding concept had vanished, then toward the garden doors where the plaque outside still read Margaret Rose Garden through the rain. "So that is it," she said, her voice lower now, thinner. "You are going to ruin everything over a name on a sign?" Eleanor looked at her, not with hatred, not even with triumph. "No," she said. "I am going to protect a name that loved this house before you wanted to use it." The words settled softly, but no one mistook them for weakness. Margaret Lawson stepped beside Eleanor and placed the final authorization page on the table. "The preview event may continue in the approved public areas only," she said. "The garden name remains unchanged. The bridal suite remains closed. Historical photographs and memorial elements remain in place." Chloe turned to Alexander, waiting for him to fix what he had promised without owning. He looked at Eleanor instead, his face caught between embarrassment and something almost like resentment. "Eleanor," he said, "you could have told me before tonight." She let a faint breath leave her. For years, she had explained, softened, warned, carried, forgiven, and made space for his pride. Tonight, she had no desire to translate dignity for him. "You knew whose house this was when you married me," she said. "You only forgot when it became useful to forget." A few guests lowered their eyes. One of the foundation board members quietly set his champagne glass on a tray, as if even holding it felt too loud. Eleanor turned back to Margaret. "Any fees paid for tonight's preview can remain with the estate," she said. "Transfer them to the Margaret Caldwell Women's Housing Fund tomorrow morning." Margaret's expression softened for the first time all evening. "Of course." Chloe stared at her. "You are donating my wedding deposit?" Eleanor touched the edge of the brass key. "You paid to use rosewood," she said. "Tonight, rosewood will do what it has always done. It will shelter women who need a safe place to begin again." The sentence changed the room more than the reveal had. The estate was no longer a prize in a social contest. It was a living thing with a purpose, and Eleanor had restored that purpose in front of everyone who had watched it be insulted. Alexander took one step toward her. "We should speak privately." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw the man she had once led through the iron gates with love in her hand. The ache was still there, but it no longer ruled her. "No," she said quietly. "Not in my mother's house." She picked up the brass key, slipped it back into her clutch, and walked toward the garden doors. Margaret Lawson moved aside with a small respectful nod. Guests made space without being asked. Outside, the rain had softened to a silver mist over the rose path. Eleanor opened the door, and cool ocean air entered the ballroom, carrying the scent of wet stone, white roses, and something clean enough to feel like morning. She stepped onto the terrace beneath the old iron lanterns. Behind her, Chloe stood in the ballroom with a wedding vision she could no longer claim, and Alexander stood beside a borrowed life losing its light. Eleanor did not look back. She walked past the brass plaque bearing her mother's name, touched it once with 2 fingers, and continued down the garden path alone. She did not win her husband back. She won back the silence he had taken from her, the house he had used, the name he had allowed another woman to erase, and the woman she had almost forgotten she was.